Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast exploring life-changing career moves. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the bold decisions that transform their careers and lives. Let's dive in. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. Today, we're diving into the world of career invention with a guest who knows firsthand what it means to break free from the traditional path and forge a new one. Scott Mason, known as the Myth Slayer, went from high-powered legal roles to becoming a transformational coach for attorneys. Scott's journey is a testament to the power of rewriting your own story, and he's here to share how he's helping others do the same. If you're ready to challenge the myths holding you back and step into your true potential, then guess what? This episode is for you. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So I'm excited today. Our guest today is Scott Mason, the Myth Slayer. Scott is a transformational coach for attorneys who uses the timeless wisdom of Greek mythology to help his clients break free from toxic professional roles and rediscover their true potential. Now, with over 25 years of experience as an attorney, including C-level positions in major orgs, Scott understands the pressures and challenges that legal professionals face. But his journey didn't stop there. Scott actually transitioned from the traditional legal path to entrepreneurship, creating a signature coaching program that is actually changing lives. And now he's here to share his story, the pivotal moments that led him to where he is today, and how he's helping others ignite their inner charisma and craft their own roadmap to professional freedom. So Scott, welcome to Why I Left. How you doing?
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here and I am doing great.
Awesome. So gave a quick background, and look, I'm very intrigued by your journey, right? Not only because of the attorney piece, right, which we found out we have some nice overlapping entities there. But look, you come from the plains of Kansas to New York City, Ivy League law degree. Can you share more about the early influences in your life that really shaped your path towards law and leadership?
You know, there can be powerful motivation to succeed when you feel like life has left you behind. I was born in London, England. My mother was a British woman who had basically an affair with a man from Trinidad who was in London to study for law school and popped me. I was put up for adoption, raised by an African-American family in the backwoods of Kansas. It was a very working class rural background. My mom worked for a dog food factory. My dad worked for the highway patrol. And expectations just were not high for either me or those that I went to school with. Yet inside, I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. I didn't fit in with my own family. I didn't fit into the larger rural environment that I was in. I didn't fit in artistically, culturally, politically. And so I felt like I had to escape. Education was my way to escape. But since expectations were so low, I felt I had to work extra hard, prove myself over and over again without stop in order to live anything approaching a life that would be fulfilling, meaningful, or representing what I was capable of.
No, without a doubt. And when you look back, during this time and during kind of your career as a whole, what was a maybe pivotal moment or experience that made you realize that the traditional legal path wasn't fulfilling? And now, look, I'm going to start taking a new, different direction.
The very first pivotal moment I had was actually during the early weeks of law school. I remember talking to my fellow law students, and they would get so excited about, as we were diving into the case books, which are these big, thick textbooks that have these long, many ancient legal cases, big, fancy, long sentences, and a lot of details that if you read through and compared them side by side, you could understand the history of the development of a particular strain of law. but it required this deep degree of focus and attention to the detail, and then the ability to sort of synthesize them together and engage intellectually enough to be able to actually want to draw some conclusion out of it. Really, the only conclusion that I would ever draw from reading these case books was that I was bored. And I certainly didn't have the ability or interest to really draw these nuanced, subtle legal principles out of it. So I really felt like, as someone who was much more big picture oriented, much more into being exciting and engaging and oratorically pushing myself further and out there trying to pass a big picture message on, this just wasn't right for me. But I didn't do anything about it for years. It wasn't until after decades of going into job after job after job that eventually it dawned on me, nothing in this space is ever going to be right. No matter what I did, I felt bored. I had success, and particularly as I moved into more executive leadership types of positions, began to work out better. But still, as an attorney, you are always essentially expected to narrow down the funnel and become that technocrat that is able to weave those tiny case threads together, or the regulatory or law threads, into something that could carve out some tiny difference between your client's situation and the situation that might have led to a worse outcome that I wasn't going to be able to do. Eventually, I was so unhappy, struggling with things like ongoing chronic illnesses, rosacea in my face, and a foul temper. I realized I had to change, or this was going to devour me and my own life would be at risk. That was a signal.
No, without a doubt. And I appreciate you sharing that. And you touched on a little bit of this. So you transitioned from law in the public sector space, you moved on to a general counsel role, and now you've gone into entrepreneurship. What were some of the most challenging aspects of these career pivots, and how did they influence your current work as a transformational coach?
The biggest challenge right up front was simply leaving my mindset as an employee behind and taking on the role of an owner. As an attorney who works for a law firm or a big organization of any sort, we are generally, in those capacities, staff. We might be executive level staff, but we are staff. We're required to meet the deadlines set upon us by others. Our work priorities are set by others. Our mission and the vision for the enterprise that we are associated with is set by others. And the expectations of others, whether they are met or not, ultimately determine our fate, particularly vis-a-vis things like promotions, salary opportunities, as well as exposure to higher and higher levels of engagement with that organization. As an entrepreneur, all of that was on me. The vision that needed to be driving my behaviors, well, that was up to me. The mission that ultimately connected my day-to-day action to the visionary drivers of my behaviors, that was up to me. Coming to work on time, meeting a deadline, being driven to get whatever compensation that I might get, and in fact, even achieving levels of compensation, that was totally on me. And it was a huge psychological adjustment. As an entrepreneur, you eat what you kill. That check don't just magically come. Well, that was a wake-up call. Along with things like, okay, how do I deal with others? In many organizational contexts, whether it be a firm or a government agency or corporate, there are almost always power dynamics at play. And understanding and navigating those power dynamics can make or break your success. There are also certain behavioral ways of being that one might be within a large organization that can be manipulative, they can be power grabbing, they could be a whole host of elements of dysfunction in the entrepreneurial space. You have to go out there, you have to be nice, you have to be friendly, you have to be warm, you have to be open. You can't be stabbing people in the back. You can't be the subject of bad will amongst those around you. You can't stab your way to the top because ideally you're at the top. So understanding how you present, how you show up, being charismatic, being energetic, being positive, that was a huge, huge adjustment. There may be days where I didn't feel well, or I was tired, or I had other things to do. So what? I still had to be there. I had to show up. I had to, as I gradually came to understand that mission, I created, make sure that my sole responsibility was to move towards that. And everything ancillary that came with it was on me. 100% accountability. You can't blame a coworker if you're an entrepreneur.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned that. I talk with a lot of entrepreneurs on the show, and that feedback, that theme of that, at the end of the day, it's on you, is something that reigns true, right? Some people think it's just going to be kind of walk in the park, but it really is not. You do have to kind of be on every day. But people really do enjoy that because they recognize, to your point, that now I'm doing something that not only is truly on me, but I have full control over what happens next. And so I love that you mentioned that. One of the things that I noticed, not only your bio, but piggybacking off what you just said here too, you get to these high level positions and you notice that you're still bored, right? And I would imagine this feeling of being trapped, and probably at times it was kind of miserable because who wants to be bored, right? You get these feelings when you're in this role, or in these roles. So how did you end up going about breaking free from that mindset? Like, I'm bored, I'm in this mental space. How did you break free from that mindset? And what steps did you take to really start reclaiming your own professional freedom, which eventually leads you into entrepreneurship?
As I was in the last government position, that really was the crack that began to cause the sidewalk to open up into a chasm. And, that boredom manifested itself in my mind as I would think about what my future would look like. And when I imagined myself in the future, I saw myself as a grayed out, washed out older male wearing a boring suit, looking at that same crowded desk full of paper forever. And was that what I was meant to be? A mentor of mine once told me after he retired, Brian, this was one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. Harvard grad, sharp as a tack, energetic. But when he retired after a lifetime of doing the sort of legal work for other people, he said, Scott, nothing that I did in my entire career mattered. Nothing. Every single job I had, every single thing I did, someone else could have done and done just as well. And I'm okay with that. Answering your question, how I broke away from that, hearing that sort of thing, thinking about what my future could be, and then stepping back and looking at the whole thing cosmically. Maybe it sounds grandiose, but Brian, there's real truth to what I'm about to say, which is that this life that we have, the entire vastness of space, and the entire depth of time that was and will be, not only is it all that we have, but it's unique. It's unique and expands that's beyond what we could imagine. And given something that special, was I willing to waste it? Was I willing to not at least try and say, I wanted what I did to matter, even if it's small? Did I really want to leave this earth and have it be as if I never existed? And so that began to open the crack so that I could begin to see beyond the boredom, the tiredness, that future, and almost feel driven to move, to step into that space that you just referenced, that entrepreneurialism can open into, and into that mindset that allows us to become something greater. Does that answer your question?
It does, because I think it is one very insightful into having not only you, but the individual who your mentor who mentioned that, right? They were aware that what they were doing didn't truly in the grand scheme of things matter. And to your point, and to their point, he said he was okay with that. And so it was almost like him telling you, I'm presuming it was him telling you that, indirectly saying, the work that you're doing, are you okay if it doesn't really matter? And it's almost like you had to answer that. Like, he didn't ask you that, right? But it was almost like he was indirectly posing a question for you to say, are you okay with at the end of your retirement, looking back and saying, none of this really mattered, but you're okay with that? And it's almost like you answered to yourself, you know what? No, I'm not. But kudos to you for seeing it right then and there.
Thank you. And listening to you share that back, it occurred to me, I wonder if he truly was okay with it himself. Because think about it. Why would you say, and I'm okay with that, if it wasn't self-evident that you weren't?
Yeah, that's a much deeper question, right? I wonder if he was at times grappling with that at that time in his life. Like, wow, I'm okay with that. Well, at that stage, he had no other choice, right? He had no other choice to be okay with that.
Yeah.
But kudos to you for picking up the message within the message during that conversation. I had a similar type of thing happen to me actually in the city, right? Where about what are you looking for next and all that. And my boss turned to me at the time and said, oh, in 6 or 7 years, you can kind of take over this next role and look forward to that. And I had to sit back, and it was unintentional on her part, right? But I had to sit back and think about, is that what I really wanted? And I didn't answer that. Right?
Yeah.
Moving on. And so this is a great pivot into kind of what you're doing now. And your work is really focusing on helping attorneys up level their own leadership skills and reconnect with that purpose. Because I do think, I was in the employment space. It is, and I would imagine, probably M&A attorneys and all these other, like a lot of that work, it's not exactly sexy work, right? Some of the cases I may have had may have been sexy, right? But it's not a good time in people's lives when you're truthfully coming to see somebody like me, or I have to investigate something. It's not like a good time, right? You're not happy to see me, right? But so this reconnecting with their purpose piece is something that I love that you're a part of. What do you think are some of the common challenges you see among lawyers today? And how does your approach help address them and really break out of that?
I'll deal with the common challenges before I get to the approach. Obviously, one of them is money. Will I lose money when I transition? And will I be able to recover what I've lost as I move along? Will I be able to live the lifestyle that I may have become accustomed to, even if I'm making myself miserable and ruining my life maintaining that lifestyle? I can relate to that because when I left being an attorney behind and being on my own, like I said, you kill what you eat only what you kill. And if you didn't kill anything that day, you might be kind of hungry for a while. That being said, more deeply, that as well as a host of other challenges that lawyers, and I'm sure a lot of other highly skilled professionals, a lot of people generally face, relates to the connection between job role and identity, confusion about the two. Now, if I were to meet you, Brian, or to have met you when you were in that space in your life you just mentioned a few minutes ago, and asked you, who are you? There's at least a halfway decent chance that you would have said, I am an employment lawyer. What are you really saying when you use those words? You're saying, in response to a question about identity, the role that you're playing professionally. And when you conflate role with identity, change becomes unbelievably dangerous because you feel you have nothing without it. Think about it. Role and identity are not the same. There's a lot of great thinking out there about this, but suffice it to say, and I'll summarize what other people have said better, which is that identity includes everything from your history to the affinity group that you're part of, to clubs that you may belong to, hobbies that you may have, your space within your family, your spiritual quest, a whole host of other sorts of things that are all, and the future that you want to have for yourself. All of those sorts of things are really what identity is. But many of these jobs are so all consuming that people can forget in their day to day lives that there is anything else to their identity. If you are feeling as though moving from your role into another role is really shedding your entire identity behind, then you're going to find a zillion reasons why you can't change, because you're going to feel as though you're leaving everything that matters behind. Not only that, but if you are a professional of the sort like a lawyer or an accountant, or let's say a compliance officer or an engineer, a lot of the identity that you have built for yourself, if you have conflated role with identity, includes the function of that role within the larger landscape that you operate in, whether it's the public sector landscape or the business landscape or whatever. And in those situations, much of the functional purpose of those roles is related to avoiding risk. If you're a structural engineer, your whole function is to make sure that bridges don't face the risk of collapse. If you are a surgeon, your role is to reduce the risk that a patient will die or suffer serious harm. If you're an attorney, your goal is to make sure that the client is not going to face litigation, or if it does, the suffering will be nominal. And if you therefore are defining your identity by a role that itself has imbued in its very essence avoidance of risk, then not only are you going to feel, if you switch your roles, that you're giving up your identity, but you're also going to be dispositionally opposed to that, because that itself is an act of risk, which you're designed day to day to avoid at all costs. And those challenges ultimately drive why many lawyers cannot or will not make this change until the situation is so dire that literally they feel like they have no other choice.
I got to tell you, you really hit the nail on the head. And I'm going to speak, personally here, in that when I was making that transition from private sector for a little bit, then went to public sector and was looking for another opportunity back in the private sector and couldn't find something, a part of my struggle was releasing that identity, right? And that, wow, if I'm in it, because what I ended up doing is I went from the employment law space, then I went to HR, right? And I was doing other types of things in that space. And to me, it felt at the time that I failed, right? Because what am I doing? You're a lawyer, for God's sakes. Why are you doing this thing now? Did you just give up on yourself? And I had to fight that so much. So my whole life has kind of been this whole, not whole life, but a lot of the times professionally has been this battle of identity and still wanting to take risk, yet to your point, mitigate risk in what I'm doing. And how can that not influence some of the things I do in my personal life? And so I love that you mentioned that, because I know for a fact that's, I've experienced that. And to your point, with all the folks you likely coach, you hear people go through similar things. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, no, and I just have to say in response, thank you for sharing that. I will never forget, maybe you and the people who are listening to or watching the show will relate to this. I went to a Christmas party when I was at my first entrepreneurial venture, which was a manufacturing firm that I co-owned. And I'll never forget, it was all lawyers that were at this Christmas party that I had worked with previously. And I was about to turn the door to walk into the apartment where the party was being held, and I felt overcome with fear. That idea that you just expressed, people are going to view me as a failure. Otherwise, why would I have left the law? It was like a tidal wave that completely overcame me. Now, I took a deep breath. I was like, I've come too far here. I've already turned the knob on this doggone door. I'm just going to open it. Although I did want to run, I have to admit. And fortunately, there was a woman who was standing on the other side who I remembered, and she was so warm and welcoming. And she asked me what I was doing. And I nervously blurted out, and I said, I'm kind of afraid to tell people this. And she said, are you kidding? Everyone here is going to be jealous of you. You're going to be the belle of the ball. So we're telling ourselves myths about what other people might be thinking when we feel that, but it's a toxic myth that can be so, again, consuming. It's next to impossible for us to see our way out of it alone.
Right. No, without a doubt. So yeah, I love that you mentioned that. I want to pivot now to talk a little bit about your signature program that I learned more about. It's this 4-stage program you have. It begins with this principle around unshackle yourself from toxic myths and roles, and it kind of piggybacks off what you just mentioned. And so, can you elaborate on what these toxic myths are and commonly manifest in the legal profession?
Happily. Toxic myths are personal narratives that we tell ourselves that ultimately drive our professional outcomes. Answering the second part of your question before going any further, to the extent that we embody consciously or subconsciously these myths, they play out for attorneys or anyone else with regards to the decisions that we make and ultimately the particular life situations that we find ourselves walking into. These toxic myths are actually based on genres of Greek mythology. And the reason why I chose to correlate Greek myths as a storytelling mode with toxic myths as an internal narrative mode is because really what those old stories were cultural projections of internal ways of thinking. They were public narratives of internal personal stories. The 5 toxic myths are genres of Greek myths that correlate to belief systems that keep us stuck. The 5 toxic myths are as follows. Number 1, the tragic origin myth, which is the story people tell themselves that the circumstances of their birth or early life drives their future. I was born as an analytical numbers cruncher, therefore I'm going to be a lawyer that specializes in forensic accounting, or something like that. Number 2, the social myth. You are living out the social myth when your behaviors or actions are driven by the expectations of others. I am always going to be an attorney because everyone in my entire family was an attorney. Number 3, the ritual myth, which occurs when the behaviors that you are engaging in repeatedly do not serve you, yet as if by ritual, you continue day after day after day after day after day to indulge them. I hate being an attorney. It makes me sick. There's nothing worse than coming in and sitting at this desk every morning and doing my job. Yet day after day after day, ritualistically, you continue to do that. Number 4, the doomsday myth. When you're stuck in the doomsday myth, you believe that any new type of decision or pivot point in your life that you take will lead to cataclysm. If I decide to leave the law behind and go into HR, it's going to lead to a financial or reputational or familial or otherwise catastrophic result. And finally, the underworld myth. If you are perpetually stuck in a state of mental, emotional, or spiritual darkness, literally like Hades in Greek mythology, the office cynic, or the person who believes, well, everyone else gets what they want in life, It's me that's just going to be destined to be a miserable, grayed out attorney. The future version of myself that I imagined. Anyone who's thinking that way is living out the underworld myth.
Love that. And now let's move to the second stage. So this program now involves writing yourself a new book of myths. So you just kind of gave us the 5 myths there. Now you're writing yourself a new book of myths. How do you guide clients through this inner, what I like to call archaeological dig to uncover their innate possibilities?
You want to visit the oracle. The oracle in Greek myths was a mysterious priestess of the god Apollo. Any and everyone could go to her and ask her a question, and she'd give you an answer. But you better be careful about what you asked, because her answer was always true, even if you didn't understand the answer. The answers as to who and what we should become are within us. We seek the oracle inside. I ask them to tap into the oracle by doing things like exploring their childhood relics. What did you care about when you were a child before limitations were put on you? What did you dream about? What were your favorite TV shows? Who did you want to be when you grew up? What did you want to be? What did you give up? What were the things that you did for fun? I also ask people then to begin to imagine what it would be like to live as if those things had come true. I also ask people to examine in detail their skills and experience and see to what extent, of course, that they are transferable. But then also I ask them to connect that to purpose. There's a whole process that I have for being able to identify and uncover your purpose. And you engage in that by exploring, among other things, what is the bigger picture place that your stream in the professional world occupies. Who do you serve that is above and beyond you, that you really care about, and that connects to all of those things that we talked about before? Also, importantly, we go through a deep, deep, deep dive into what your unique inner truth values are, not what everyone tells you your values should be, not what everyone else says is good or right, what you think is good or right. For instance, if everyone around you is saying that work-life balance is important, don't just say that. Is that your true inner truth value? Scott Mason's inner truth value is that work-life balance doesn't matter. I don't care. And so, right, if what you believe is unconventional, lean into that. And then what are your non-negotiables? What are the things that you cannot or will not sacrifice? Now, that's different from what's inconvenient for you. Reducing your salary is likely an inconvenience. But for instance, not being able to take care of a sick parent that is living with you really is a non-negotiable. Or moving to a country where you don't know the language, don't know anyone, and would be miserable. That's a non-negotiable. And so identifying those things tied to an understanding of what your strengths and weaknesses are and what strengths that you're capable of either leaning into or developing that you don't have, tying that all into a package, we create a vision as to what the next step would look like, how it would feel. And once you have that, you have the groundwork for making decisions. You've heard the oracle.
Love that. And now these final stages really focus on igniting your inner charisma and then creating a professional freedom roadmap, which it sounds like you kind of tee up in that and what you were just mentioning. So in thinking about those things, I'd love for you to now maybe share a success story where a client, transformed their career and life through this process.
I'm actually going to share the story of one of my longest term clients who, when I first met him, he's not a lawyer. He's a professional in another sector. But when I first met him, he was making a decent amount of money, but he was confused, lost, and overwhelmed in the career that he had chosen. And we gradually walked him through this process. We had some detours, we took some time and had some patience and periodic check ins. But where is he at now? Well, I was trying to think before this interview for the word for this. How they say someone's income is tripled or quadrupled. I don't know how I would say it if it's gone up about 6 or 7 fold. So that's what happened with regards to his income. He now owns his second house. He opened a second location for his business. He has more time with his family. He feels satisfied. He is on the board of directors of a major professional organization. He has written a book and he is emerging as a thought leader, including having a presence on YouTube. And he's loving it all. As his career didn't entirely change, but its direction began to pivot and sharpen into what he understands his mission and his vision, how they tie together and what they demand that he is. So there's a lot possible once you really know who and what you are, once you focus and execute.
Yeah, and I think that last piece you just mentioned is huge, right? And what's funny, I was just on a show, and the title of the show was called Dream, Plan, Execute. And what's interesting is we all dream, we all plan, but as you know, not a lot of us will then execute. And so, to your point with that gentleman there, that execution piece got him where he needed to be. So kudos to you for the guidance, and kudos to him for what I don't know what you'd call that, septuple double. I don't know what that is, right? So I'm thinking of babies, right? I'm thinking of septuplets, but I don't know what it's called when you actually multiply by that.
Septupled his income. I have no idea.
I don't know. But no, thank you for that. And now I'd love to. You've been dropping some gems throughout, but this part of the show, I really like to get some advice from my guests for the listeners, because there's a lot of people who, as I've continued to grow the brand and the show, who are really going through a lot, at times don't have the support system, maybe don't have or don't necessarily trust too much the support system they have, and they look to others for guidance in this type of space in trying to make moves. And so I want to really focus it on attorneys, but truthfully, we could put professionals there as well. But for professionals, attorneys who may feel stuck or disconnected from their professional lives, what is the first step that they should take to start their journey toward professional freedom today?
Scroll back through this show and take notes on the 5 toxic myths. Then spend the time that you need to ask yourself and answer honestly, which of these am I living out? The biggest first step that anyone can take is understanding what's imprisoning them. If you understand what's imprisoning you, you're well positioned to at least begin to, using the word that you put into the discussion earlier, unshackle yourself. And once you're unshackled, of course, all of the other steps can eventually come to place. Is it easier to work with someone to do that? Of course it is. But all of this is totally possible once you understand what's keeping you from being able to experience that change and live out that vision, to feel like you've gone to Mount Olympus.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And you mentioned it's always good to be working with a coach and things like that. But at times you shared that sometimes professional coaching programs really lack imagination and personalization, right? So what advice would you give to these same professionals who may be seeking a coach to ensure that they find someone who's really right for them and can guide them on their own unique and effective journey?
3 things. First of all, interview quite a few. Don't just settle on the first one, or because your homeboy XYZ knows person ABC who happens to be a coach. And look at their credentials. There are coaches, and I hate to be this way, but there are coaches that became coaches after, let's say, their candy store closed and they needed something else to do to supplement their income. Do they actually have the real life experience to be able to back up the transformational promises in particular that they're making? And after you've interviewed a few, to some extent, really say to yourself, okay, is my gut going with that person? Am I feeling that person? Don't let your brain totally drive, mix brain with feeling, spirit, or heart. Sometimes, if you listen there, you'll really know. Number two, make sure that they have some sort of program, because you don't want to just have it. It can sometimes work if it's just sort of a therapy session, but you want to have some sort of organizational structure that you follow to lead you to specific outcomes, and to be able to have you and the coach come into alignment as to what those outcomes should be. But that being said, also make sure that that program is customizable. The program should be in existence to serve the needs of you as the client. You as the client should not be there to be pushed through the program. So if it's not customizable to who and what you actually are, okay, that's nice. They have a program, but run for the hills. Finally, check into what sort of or between conversation communication channels are out there, as well as the extent to which there is original intellectual property that the coach has. There are coaches that go with systems that they've basically bought from other entities, or they may be certified to coach XYZ through some larger organization that provides them with a framework and outline for their coaching process. So that's not necessarily their intellectual property. You may or may not feel comfortable with that. My clients tend to like the fact that my intellectual property is totally and completely mine. Others may feel safer with someone that's using the intellectual property of another, but you need to know that. And then between sessions, is it just you meet and then you don't speak again for another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or a month? Or do you have ongoing communication? And if you don't have ongoing communication, maybe through a Slack channel or a WhatsApp conversation or something like that, I really, really would be cautious. Finally, get a sense as to whether the coach is a clock watcher or not. I've worked with coaches that will spend the time that I need with me. I've also worked with coaches that are like, okay, it's exactly 5 on the dot. I know you just told me that your mother died, but time's up. See you in a month. Try and go for the former.
Right. Absolutely. And as you look towards the future, right? I think you got a lot of great things that are happening in your space and with your work. But what type of impact are you hoping to have as you look forward?
I love that you asked that question. As you might have suspected listening to me talk, it's my belief that Greek myths are the greatest personal and professional transformational tools that have ever existed. Homer, Hesiod, Ovid, these poets, they didn't just stand up and tell these stories for entertainment's sake. They told them because there were lessons that the cultures who were taking them in were using to create themselves and to become better as individuals within that culture. My bigger game is to revive these stories and have as many people as possible understand that if you really take them in, absorb them, understand and feel, and then act, then you can experience their power and your life can completely change. That's what my longer term and big picture goal is.
No, I love that. And now let's flip the mic a little bit. What's one question you have for me that I could answer?
Okay, brace yourself, Brian. This is going to be a tough one.
All right.
If you had a Greek god avatar, who would that avatar be?
So, I was thinking about this. One of the things that I loved, I saw an individual named Helios, right? It's like the god of light, god of sun, all those types of things. I think I resonated with that. And I probably would have been different if I was younger, but now I really resonate with Helios, because bringing light to situations and being that beacon of light, sometimes hope, if you want to make any parallels for some, is something that I kind of fancied myself as doing with certain situations. And I think about that not only with the show, I think about that what I'm doing on the outside, or not the outside, but really like what I do in my day-to-day life. I have a way of bringing light to certain situations. In this case, I'm a big proponent of the human experience, and that we're also connected, and that we don't talk about resignations enough. So I want to bring light to that situation. And And I'm not tiptoeing into this topic either. Like, I'm coming in, I'm very intentional. I'm bringing on guests who are impactful in this very specific niche of mine. On the professional side, it's all about right now health education specifically, but healthcare education more directly, in that people need to know, young people need to know the opportunities that exist in healthcare. And there's a pointed efforts that I'm leading that kind of really focused on me kind of bringing light to certain situations. Now, granted, I'm one of many who are involved in these types of things, but when I kind of heard this and thought about this, that Helios, kind of the god of sun, bringing light to situations, I really resonated with that, and I'm trying to embody that the best that I can.
I'll just share something real quick about Helios. He's my avatar too. No wonder we get along so well.
Oh, I did not know that. Okay.
Yes. If you were blind and Helios's hands touched your eyes, you could see again. Think about that as a metaphor for your own mission.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, I'm sitting there thinking, like, yeah, that is very poignant for a lot of the things that I'm doing. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. I have a feeling we may have to talk about this again sometime, but that's another story.
Well, definitely open to that. So, well, look, Scott, this was great. I'm glad we got connected. And shout to, it was the World Podcast Network is how we got connected. So huge shout out to them. Quick backstory. When I first started this show, the gentleman who runs it and that network was one of the first people who I actually connected with to kind of like, what are they doing in this space and whatnot? And I've kind of watched him and that page and that brand grow. And so when they started this new piece where they're looking for guests or connecting guests with show hosts, I loved it. And seeing your profile, definitely connected and loved your story. So shout to World Podcast Network. I thank you all. They're not a sponsor or anything like that, but it's just a genuine, like, I appreciate you all putting us in touch, because Scott, it was really a pleasure, hearing your story. So where can our listeners find you, follow you, and support the work that you're doing?
Go to myfreedomrocks.com. That's myfreedomrocks.com. You'll see links to all of my socials there, as well as some TEDx talks and some ebooks that I have written. Any questions that you have or any follow-up that you want to take yourself into, hey, that's the place where the rabbit hole begins.
Perfect. I love that. Well, thank you. And look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Scott Mason for joining me today. I'll put all that information in our show notes. And I hope you all have a great week. You picked up some great nuggets from our chat, and we'll definitely see you all next time. So, Scott, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Why I Left. Join us next time for more inspiring stories about growth, resilience, and transformation. Visit us online at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the Alive Podcast Network. See you soon.